In 1350, what we know as the idyllic French countryside was a living hell. For more than 15 years, the people had suffered at the hands of English invaders. Little did they know that this war would last for another 100 years. But through this crucible of fighting, famine, and plague, there would emerge the modern nation of France. England's King Edward III looked jealously across the English Channel. Wanting France for his own, he had added the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, to his own royal standard. This was an all-out declaration of war. And in 1337, he invaded. But France already had a king, Philippe VI. As the English burned their way across the land, Philippe's army and his legendary knights marched to meet them and came face to face with the English longbow. A simple weapon, but the most devastating the knights had ever faced. The heroes of France fell to storms of English arrows. The war engulfed the French countryside. By 1351, the conflict was focused on Brittany. One fight stands out as a spectacular display of chivalry and a symbol of the wider conflict between the two enemy nations. The Combat of the 30 is still commemorated here in Brittany. It was a dispute between two local families. Supported by the opposing sides in the war, the French and English commanders decided to settle it through a trial of knightly combat. Each side would choose 30 champions to fight on neutral ground. France prepared to defend itself against England's finest. Intent on ending the suffering of the French peasantry, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir sent a challenge to the English commander. 30 champions on each side would compete in a tournament for final claim to Brittany. With the battleground of the halfway oak agreed upon, Sir Jean set out to gather support from local knights. As a knight himself, Sir Jean followed the strict rules of chivalry and was expected to protect the local peasantry and ensure peace. Most medieval tournaments were friendly in nature, held for sport and glory, but the Combat of the 30 was arranged between opponents mired in war. Sir Jean spotted an English raiding party attacking a nearby farmstead. The French knights defeated the English raiders, and Sir Guy de Rochefort joined Sir Jean's party. Sir Jean's search next brought him to Sir Geoffroy du Bois, whose squires were contending with a detachment of English longbowmen. The knights would use the great speed of their war horses to charge the archers and overwhelm them. The English longbowmen fell, but the French knights knew the enemy would attempt to retake the hilltop fortification and steeled themselves for further attacks. With Sir Geoffroy by his side, Sir Jean had secured the outpost. Looking to secure his honor, a young knight held his ground on a bridge in Sir Jean's path. Honorably conceding defeat in the duel, Sir Yves Charel joined the cause. Sir Jean entered the staging area for the tournament, where he prepared to choose which knights would join him in battle. Each knight would be accompanied by his squires, young nobles in training to become knights themselves. Sir Jean had selected his champions. As the sun rose, the two sides entered the arena, ready for the first round of combat. Claiming an easy victory in the first round, the French champions left the arena to recover their strength. Refreshed and reinvigorated, the French knights returned to the arena for another round of combat. Triumphant, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir and his loyal knights claimed victory. The combat of the 30 had decided control of Brittany in favor of the French. Little did the two sides know, this was just the beginning of a bitter war that would outlive them all. After victory at the combat of the 30, the French faced devastating raids from England's Black Prince. But France's King John II was closing in. Jean finally caught the English near the city of Poitiers in September 1356. The French army outnumbered the English by thousands. King Jean himself joined the fight, but what seemed a certain victory for France soon turned into a nightmare. The English longbow devastated the mighty French army. An endless hail of arrows gutted the main French force. Then the English captured King Jean. The fight was over. The Battle of Poitiers was another catastrophic defeat for the French. The English had destroyed most of France's nobility in a single day. Now they turned their attention towards taking the French capital, Paris. The invaders marched unopposed towards Paris. The remains of some of the medieval walls of Paris still stand today. As the English army approached, the terrified locals sought shelter behind these defenses. Could France's capital withstand the full might of the Black Prince's army? The English Black Prince had raided the French countryside without mercy, and now his army had come for the capital. With the English on their doorstep, it fell to the French army and the people of Paris to defend the walls of their proud city. Hoping to avoid open battle, the French began fortifying the city, manning the walls and calling every available soldier to his post. As the French hastened their preparations, several detachments of English soldiers were spotted closing in on the city. As the French continued to rally their army, the English took the last of the surrounding villages and had almost encircled Paris. Now came the capital's true test. Would the mighty walls of Paris hold against a fearsome English siege? The Parisian Guard raised the alarm as the English began their first assault on the city walls. The French defense of their capital held firm, wearing down the English invaders one by one. Defeated and demoralized by the strength of the French defense, the Black Prince's army abandoned their siege of the capital. Paris celebrated victory, but this was not the last test the French would face in their struggle to win the war. The walls of Paris held out against the English onslaught. England's King Edward and the Black Prince abandoned the siege. They marched towards Chartres to try their luck at conquering a less formidable target. But before they could attack, a violent storm hit the army. Killing 1,000 English soldiers in a tempest of hail and freezing winds. To Edward, this Black Monday disaster seemed like divine retribution. A sign that it was time to stop waging war and make peace with France's King Jean. But even as peace between kings was reached, the people of France were still living in bloodshed and turmoil. Between 1358 and 1370, France was in chaos. Peasant uprisings, rampaging bands of mercenaries, and civil war ravaged the country. Peasants rose in rebellion, killing their lords and wreaking havoc. Mercenary bands also roamed the land. Known as routiers, they had once been hired by the English to fight against the French, but were cut loose when peace was reached. They systematically ravaged and pillaged towns across France. And with King Jean prisoner in England, his son Charles the Dauphin faced homegrown attacks on his rule by powerful French lords, beset from all sides. The Dauphin's forces had to regain control over their own country. Having only recently been crowned King of France, Charles V dispatched his army to the French-held village of Évreux to forge order from chaos. From here, the army would move to extinguish three major threats: bands of roving mercenaries harrying the countryside, a peasant uprising, and attacks from a rival for the French crown, Charles of Navarre. The French army would start by reclaiming the rebel-held villages of Cocherel, Jouy, and Croissy. In taking the village of Jouy, the French army was closer to stemming the peasant rebellion and regaining control. The village of Croissy, rich in gold deposits, was a crucial town for the French to reclaim. The French army defeated the rebels at Croissy and took control of the gold-rich village. The central monastery town of Cocherel was still under the control of rebel peasants. The French army would have to take it before they could launch an assault on Charles of Navarre. The French army took control of the rebel villages, and the peasant uprising was subdued. But to keep control over the region, they would need to defend its center of influence, the monastery at Cocherel. Northeast of Cocherel, Charles of Navarre's army had established a fortified camp. The King of Navarre sought to make himself ruler of France as well. He intended to press his claim by destroying the newly arrived royal forces. Pushing up the hillside, the French discovered Charles of Navarre's camp. His front line had the high ground and was made up entirely of archers. The French would have to think carefully about how to approach the stronghold. The French army had repelled Charles of Navarre, stemmed the revolt, and held back the raids of the routiers. In the struggle for control over France's lands, the king still clung to power. The French town of Pontvallain lay directly in the path of marauding English soldiers on the hunt for loot. The town's only hope of survival lay with the French forces camped nearby. The French quickly prepared to ambush the disorganized English raiders and defend Pontvallain from ruin. The main English army thundered into the valley. They paused to rest beyond the town before launching their raid. The first group of English raiders began their attacks on the outlying farms. After destroying the farms, they would attack the town of Pontvallain. The English army chose their moment and began to close in on Pontvallain. After a hard-won battle against a scattered enemy, the French succeeded in halting the English chevauchés at Pontvallain. The English army was not invincible. The French cause was not yet lost. The French won an overwhelming victory at the Battle of Pontvallain. It was the first time the English had been utterly defeated during the war. But the triumph was short-lived. As England spent the next 60 years amassing French territory through alliances and victories at great battles such as Agincourt. It seemed that nothing could stop England. Who then could have foreseen that a teenaged girl was about to change the course of history? In 1429, France was in dire straits. Nowhere was it more evident than the besieged city of Orléans. The city was completely surrounded by English-held forts. But just a few days' ride away, here in Chinon, there was potential help. The French royal prince, the Dauphin Charles, was holed up in his fortress and under pressure to ride out to save Orléans. As Charles hesitated, a young peasant girl arrived at his court. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. She claimed to have received saintly visions, giving her a divine task to help Charles become king and drive the English out of France forever. Charles was skeptical, but was soon convinced of her divinity. And he charged this 17-year-old with the near impossible mission to liberate Orléans. To Jeanne, this was the first step in realizing her God-given destiny. In April 1429, she rode out from Chinon at the head of her army to confront the hated enemy of France. Surrounded by English strongholds, and with its last line of defense under attack, the city of Orléans grew ever more desperate. In France's darkest hour, 17-year-old Jeanne d'Arc arrived with the king's army to liberate a city and prevent the fall of a nation. The English had captured the vital fortification, known as Les Tourelles, on the south bank of the Loire. Orléans would live or die on its access to supplies. Recapturing Les Tourelles would be key to saving the city. The French army torched the eastern English fort, securing a crossing to the south bank of the Loire River. Les Tourelles was the linchpin in the English siege of Orléans, blocking the main supply route to the city. If Jeanne d'Arc could capture it, Orléans would finally be liberated. The king's army drove the hated enemy of France from Les Tourelles. With the main road to the city back in French hands, the English abandoned their long siege of Orléans. Celebrating a momentous victory at the head of the French army, Jeanne d'Arc would forever be remembered as the Maid of Orléans. Jeanne d'Arc had liberated Orléans and put the English army to flight. However, as the English retreated, they became an obstacle for Charles the Dauphin. He needed a clear path from Chinon to Reims, where he would be crowned king. Nearing the town of Patay, the English sought to regroup. But Jeanne d'Arc and her French army were closing in. Fleeing the Loire Valley, the English were on the run. As they retreated northwards, a French vanguard was in close pursuit. Caught out of position, the French faced a surprise attack from the English rearguard. A detachment of English archers blocked the road with palings, an effective measure against cavalry. The French vanguard had to clear the road if they were to call in reinforcements. With the road cleared, the French army could safely bring in reinforcements from nearby allies. The French army saw a chance to bolster their numbers and sent payment to their ally in return for reinforcements. Hearing the rallying cry of the English coming from the village of St. Sigmund, the French were alerted to the enemy position. The French recaptured St. Sigmund and prepared to rendezvous with Jeanne d'Arc. But a large English detachment had set up a blockade. So long as that force was in place, the French vanguard could not reach Jeanne. With the English blockade destroyed, the French vanguard rejoiced at the arrival of Jeanne d'Arc and her troops. With their rearguard eliminated, the remaining English forces would now seek to escape the valley through the town of Patay. 3 enemy regiments were converging on the town along 3 main roads. Jeanne had either to stop the regiments on the roads or race ahead to fortify Patay itself. As the forces of the valiant Jeanne d'Arc entered the town, the people of Patay rallied to her cause. After an intense pursuit and a hard-fought battle, the French crushed the remaining English army, thwarting their desperate retreat. Now the triumphant Jeanne d'Arc could safely lead Charles to Reims for his coronation as King of France. The Battle of Patay was a disaster for the English. The French wiped out their bowmen and drove their forces from the Loire Valley. Now for Jeanne d'Arc and the Dauphin, the way to Reims was clear. The Maid of Orleans rode with the Dauphin through the streets and was at his side when he was finally crowned King Charles VII of France. But less than 2 years later, Jeanne was captured in battle, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy. She spent 6 months locked in a dungeon, awaiting her fate. King Charles, who owed his crown to Jeanne, did nothing to help win her freedom. She was found guilty. On May 30th, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was brought here, to the old market square in Rouen, where she was burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. But what the Maid of Orleans started could not be denied. Her victories were the first in a chain of successes for France's military. Liberty was within reach. Thanks to the leadership of 2 brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, the French army became experts in the use of artillery, transforming it into a disciplined, modern fighting force. In 1448, King Charles was ready to make a major move against the English. He vowed to retake Normandy. King Charles VII's army would soon have access to the most advanced artillery in Europe, thanks to the master gunners, the Bureau brothers. While the brothers developed their weapons, the king laid plans for their use. He would bring Normandy back under French control. The first phase of the king's plan would give the Bureau brothers time to perfect their cannons. He tasked his army with claiming a base of operations. With the town under French control, the Bureau brothers now had the use of the university and of their own siege workshop. Their next goal was to learn all they could about recent innovations in the mixing of the most potent gunpowder. The Bureau brothers had successfully combined a powerful gunpowder recipe with sturdy cast iron gun barrels. At last, cannon production could begin. At last, the French artillery weapons were ready for deployment. After years of preparation, the time had come for Charles VII to make his move. To take back Normandy, he would need to recapture the stronghold of Rouen, a critical fortress from which the English had been attacking Paris. Rouen walls would face an explosive trial against the mighty force of gunpowder. The French army bore down on the formidable walls of Rouen, ready to launch their final assault on this key English stronghold. Rouen walls were breached. The French army had at last exposed the heart of the fortress. The French would need to destroy the buildings that had housed the English army and drive out the enemy for good. With the English scattered and their buildings in ashes, the French had recaptured the critical fortress of Rouen. Charles VII had proven that France was no longer the underdog in the 100 Years' War. After decades of bloody dispute, Normandy was finally back in French hands. Thanks to the explosive force of cannon fire, the French were close to victory in this century-long war. But in a final grasp at power, the English dispatched a fresh army, equipped with their tried and tested longbows. Formigny would be a trial of old versus new, to determine the fate of France. English commander Sir Thomas Kyriel sent a large expedition to crush the French in Normandy. The village of Carentan was directly in their path. Massively outnumbered, the French skirmishers near Carentan would give their lives to weaken the English. Though they fought bravely, the French skirmishers could only slow the English advance. The main body of the French army finally arrived in the river valley. The French now needed to locate and destroy the English army. But they would face a well-entrenched enemy, with several local garrisons. The French destroyed the garrison at Retake. The English base at Saint-Sauveur fell to the French forces, but the enemy army was still at large. The French forces located Kyriel's English army at a river crossing near the town of Formigny. Even with their cannons, the French faced the difficult task of engaging the well-positioned English army.
Ainsi sera fait.
The French attacks succeeded in drawing the English front line out of position and across the river. Suffering losses, the English front line retreated back across the river. The French received word that their Breton allies had arrived with their knights and horsemen. Now the two armies could coordinate. The Bretons saw an opportunity to attack the English from the back. As the Bretons attacked, the English had no choice but to pivot their front line, opening their flanks to attack from the French. Beset by the French and Bretons, the English beat a hasty retreat toward Formigny. With the last English army destroyed and the gates of Formigny thrown open, the French force in Normandy was victorious. Their well-organized forces and superior firepower had brought the arduous 100 Years' War closer to its conclusion. At Formigny, the roar of cannon fire sounded the death knell for England's ambitions in France. King Charles and the Bureau brothers did not let up on the offensive, and in 1453, the English retreated across the Channel. France was finally at peace. More than 100 years had passed since the first English chevauchés had scorched the land. The iconic French knights who fought in those early days would not have recognized their own military a century later. The English longbow, once the scourge of France, was no match for French artillery in the last years of the war. And by 1453, France's border looked very different, growing to encompass territories once claimed by England and their allies. After enduring a century of conflict, France emerged as a transformed nation. The country and its people had persevered and unified into a kingdom that could defend itself. Against all odds, France had won the 100 Years' War.